Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We're a consortium of about 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of American independence. And our guest today is Paul Douglas Lockhart. Paul Lockhart is a professor of history at Wright State University, an historian actually of war and society in the Western world in the from about 1500 to 1945. You've written about 7 books, and 2 of them are on the American Revolution. Most are on European war, but you've written 2 great books on the American Revolution. And today we're going to be talking about one, the Drillmaster of Valley Forge, which is about the Baron de Steuben, or de Steuben. We'll talk about how his name is pronounced and what his title is, and the making of the American Army. So thanks so much for joining us, Paul.
Well, thank you for having me on here.
So what got you interested in this interesting character?
A couple of things, actually. One of them was where I grew up. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, not far from Poughkeepsie, New York. And, the Revolutionary War sites, of course, were all around, right across the river from New Windsor Cantonment. And particularly what was then known as the, what was known today as Mount Julian Estate, the Verplank House in Beacon, New York, was a pretty short drive from where I live, only about 10-minute drive from where I went to middle school. So I knew all these sites, quite familiarly. Now the Revolution wasn't that interesting to me when I was a kid. I was very much a Civil War buff, even though I grew up, in the Bicentennial. I was 13 in 1976. Do the math. That, of course, I was surrounded by all that. But as I got working more into European military history, which is a process that happened when I was an undergraduate, I became more interested in the broader context of American military history. And it began to strike me that, not only did American military historians generally not put the Revolution in a broader European context, which is misleading, actually. But second, that Steuben himself kind of marked that intersection between what's European and what we tend to think of as being American in terms of a way of war. And just the fact that, as I probed into, as I worked with the subject more deeply, and then he's a fascinating character.
He really is. He really is. And you made a point, again, mysterious kind of name background. He shows up and presents himself as, I guess it's a familiar story, that he had served under Frederick the Great and that he has this title, and that's you really do an interesting job with his representations of himself as a way of trying to obtain some kind of a status in this army. But he is someone who understands something the army needs, which is drilling.
Oh yeah, and we often forget that in the drive to make him more of a good-natured fraud than he really was. And much as I love the work of Tom Fleming, he characterized Steuben as a magnificent fraud, and I've always bristled at that. In part because the persona, the slightly fictionalized persona that Steuben came with, was made for him. He did not make this. Right. I mean, it's an joint effort of Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin. And the side note here, Benjamin Franklin always gets the credit for bringing Steuben over, and I have no idea why. I mean, it's entirely Silas Deane. Franklin, an obstacle rather than an asset there. But the truth of the matter is that, first of all, in terms of his background, Steuben was, in fact, of the Prussian lower nobility, the Junker, right? American historians frequently say he can't be noble, he's not rich. Nobility doesn't mean wealth in early modern Europe. It just means privilege. It's not the same thing. He was from the Prussian Junker class, which was more or less dedicated to military service. He did not formally rise above the rank of captain in the Prussian service during the 7 Years' War, but his reputation was such that Frederick the Great and Prince Henry, Frederick's little brother, brought Steuben into this Spezielle Klasse der Kriegskunst, basically a special school for training future senior leaders of the Prussian army. So he's somebody who's being groomed, might not have been a major general, which is what Franklin said about him, but he's being groomed for a generalship.
Right.
And he's somebody who took his profession quite seriously, an extraordinarily well-read man. And we often forget, just like so many of the leaders of the Revolution, this is a child of the Enlightenment. He's a philosopher. He's extraordinarily erudite.
Yeah, yeah. You make the point. His favorite book was Don Quixote. Which is,
Yes, yeah.
It's a fascinating book that he's carrying along with him on these campaigns, along with other books.
Oh yes, yes. And when he at the time of the composition of the Blue Book, which is is a separate topic entirely. I mean, he and his assistants they're not just copying Prussian military regulations. They've got scores of major works in European military theory that they're working from at the same time.
Right. And you make the point that they're not simply copying that, but he's adapting that to the American situation. He now understands this army and what it needs.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. He does say at one point that in a European army, you give an order and the men follow it, but here you have to explain why. He said, but once they understand that, they're the best soldiers in the world.
Oh, yeah. That was his, and he did see a downside occasionally. Obviously, soldiers who are bred to deference, which is the point he was making really about Europeans, can be more pliable, when it comes to training them. But once he understood that Americans didn't think quite the same way that European soldiers did, that it was possible to work around it. Yes.
Yeah. So he arrives in America and this is when Washington's army is encamped at Valley Forge, and he spends a lot of time with Congress, which turns out to be a good thing politically for him.
Oh yeah. He makes friends there, and of course that's one of two interesting personality traits with Steuben in this regard. He's great at making friends. I mean, he's extraordinarily outgoing, affectionate, funny, witty. He's also really great at ruining his friendships because he can't control his temper.
Right.
And he frequently lashes out without filtering, before he talks. But in meeting with Congress, which was of course in exile at York, since Philadelphia was occupied at that point. He wins Congress over, and to me, one of the things that's most extraordinary about it is that he wins over Henry Laurens, who was president of Congress at that point, and he wins over Horatio Gates.
Right.
And according to some sources, even Horatio Gates's wife, who was apparently notoriously unpleasant. And so by the time he actually goes to Valley Forge early in 1778, he has Congress not only admiring him but convinced they found a pretty good deal, because Steuben doesn't ask for rank or pay. Basically, hey, if you like my job, you like what I've done at the end of the war, pay me.
Yeah. That doesn't work out too well for him.
No, it doesn't.
No. So it would seem like, though, he's cultivated friendships with Laurens and Gates. That would seem to put him at odds with Washington when he finally meets him at Valley Forge. But they have a very interesting relationship. They
do, and it's. And I think neither of them really read the other one very accurately. There's that. I don't think Steuben, for one, appreciated what a gargantuan task it was, not just to not just to fight a war and deal with Congress at the same time as Washington did, but just to keep his group of generals together who were inclined to dislike each other vehemently. And so Steuben never understood that sometimes when he put pressure on Washington, for example, for wanting rank or for wanting a combat command, that there were major political issues, and it wasn't Washington being difficult. On the other hand, I don't think Washington fully grasped that Steuben wasn't mercenary. Right. He seems to operate on that, and of course, Steuben didn't do a lot to tamp down that suspicion, because he frequently talked like that. But Steuben clearly, felt himself by the end of the war to be an American. And that was never, I don't think Washington fully appreciated. But their relationship early on, Steuben didn't entirely read Washington's. I would say it's not exactly a cool reception that he receives, but it's not trumpets and parades either. Washington was in a very difficult spot at that point. But I think Washington, from all accounts, was delighted to have Steuben where he was, because he provided something that a really direct connection with European warfare that didn't necessarily come from other generals and the other leaders in the Continental Army.
That's very true. Even the French generals don't necessarily bring them.
No, and for example, I mean, I'll admit outright, I'm not a big Lafayette fan.
Neither was Steuben, apparently.
No, it was not, definitely, and Lafayette was not a Steuben fan either. But aside from Lafayette's enthusiasm and his love for his new country, I've never really seen a great deal of evidence of ability there, and certainly not somebody who understood in a broad way the way that European military institutions worked. It really becomes obvious when Steuben drafts the Blue Book, or after the war when he's drafting ideas for a future American military establishment. It's clear that he knows, these days, the military organization better than just about anybody else in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're talking with Paul Douglas Lockhart, professor at Wright State University, author of The Drillmaster of Valley Forge, the Baron de Steuben and the Making of the American Army. A terrific book, really a biography, but also an explanation of how von Steuben forms this army when he arrives and begins forming it, drilling, but then writing the Blue Book. And then, as you said, unlike a lot of the other European generals, he stays here after the war, too. I mean, he really has committed himself to the United States.
Yes.
Let's talk about how he trains the soldiers then. He gets to Valley Forge, and why don't you tell us what he does to implement this new discipline into the Army?
Well, he understood, and don't get me wrong, the Continental Army at this point is a veteran army, and they've shown some significant promise even in defeat. I mean, Germantown, for example, which is a terrible defeat, but it was damn close. And if nothing else, the Army showed a great deal of fighting spirit. And the fact that any of it survives into the winter of 77-78 is in itself, I think, kind of remarkable. But what Steuben understood from kind of an adjective's point of view was that different regimental commanders were using different drill manuals. And the differences between them, if you're not a teenage drill head like I was, differences between them are so trivial that they don't really seem like much. But even a difference in the cadence of the step or the length of the step can make a gigantic difference. Minor tactics, drill, in other words, is absolutely essential, for any kind of organized warfare in the 18th century. So what he does is he recognizes this, among other shortcomings of the Army, because his initial time at Valley Forge is mostly spent out sniffing out problems and coming back to Washington and reporting about it. And Washington assigns him his task, and a couple things that are interesting about it to me. First of all, the training method, which was to take essentially NCOs, sergeants primarily, and some commissioned officers from all regiments of the line, from regiments throughout the encampment, and train them in the drill, and then they would go off, of course, and train their own. It's a very efficient way of doing that. Second, that it's funny that this is the thing that Steuben is most remembered for. And it's a thing that he considered to be his least achievement, and his lesser achievement, I guess I should say, and his and something that a puppet could practically do. That it really didn't take much in the way of brains. But what he did, very often you'll see accounts where he takes the Prussian drill manual and the British manual was practically the same as the Prussian drill manual. He did not do. He simplified the so-called manual of arms, the postures, the busket. But to him, this is ephemeral. This isn't that important. What's important is that the men know how to march, and that was really what he emphasized: is length of step, timing of step, maintaining formation when wheeling, when changing from line to column, from column to line, etc. And this is, of course, it's the beginning of a trend, but it is already by the time Lafayette attempts his expedition to Baron Hill in May of 1778, the Army is clearly moving in a much different way than it ever moved before. So of course, the other thing about this episode is that it establishes Steuben as a legend in his own time. because I made the argument, and maybe a little bit hyperbolic, but I don't think, except for Washington, I don't think there was a general who was better known on sight by the majority of the soldiers of the Continental Army, and probably more recognizable than Washington because he was around the soldiers constantly.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not only that, but the fact that his temperament was such that he would mingle anger with fake anger, with theatricality, and of course they became known. And these are soldiers; they appreciate good profanity. As he said once, he by force of his goddams, he transformed the army. These comical episodes of him swearing at the soldiers in a combination of French and German, and turning to one of his aides and saying, "I need you to translate. So swear at them for me for a while. I'll run out."
Does he learn English?
Oh yeah, quite well. In fact, he's already pretty fluent by the time he gets to America. It's a quick study, and he clearly studied English on the voyage over from France, and he's definitely conversant in it. You can tell that just looking at his writings, when he writes notes to himself, it's almost in French. Of course, that's the language of the Enlightenment, right? I mean, this is the lingua franca of educated men and educated women.
Right.
But his command of English is pretty good. The only time it really becomes noticeably weird is when he's trying to relate place names, which mostly phonetically.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. And then of course the big thing he does is write the Blue Book, the standard manual. That's a massive project, which he does in an incredibly short time.
Oh yeah. And granted, he has a good bunch of aides working for him.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there were some real obstacles. First of all, he himself in a way was an obstacle. He really believed that he was destined to be a combat commander. Right. And this is what he wanted. He was a soldier. He loved battle. And he missed that during the times that he was a courtier. During the time he was a courtier. And the fact that he was involved, he was in the thick of things at Monmouth in June of '78, convinced him that it was now apparent. Everybody knows he's a good combat commander. There weren't enough combat commands, obviously, to go around, and Washington had to give precedence to born Americans, instead of newcomers. So the fact that he's in Philadelphia writing a manual when he feels he should be out in the field leading troops, you could see that eating at him while he's doing this. You can see it in the way that his temper flares when there's problems, and hard time finding engravers, for example, to handle the plates in the Blue Book, and it's just I mean, if you're an engraver's apprentice or a printer's apprentice, and you had the opportunity to go off on with a letter of marque on board a privateer and make real money, why would you stay home and create
plates?
But he sees this as Congress messing with him, as Congress throwing obstacles in his way. But yet, he composes the Blue Book, which is, first of all, of course, a drill manual. I mean, that's the most basic part of it. But he lays out in a way that I think even more so than most 18th century drill manuals, lays out standard operating procedures for typically encountered tactical scenarios, emerging from a narrow defile into an open field. How do you set up a bivouac? How do you set up a camp? Where do you place the toilets, the sinks, as opposed to where the officers' tents go, etc. There was practical, where there was not. I mean, granted, the Continental Army had its own methods, but here Steuben is laying down a standardized procedure based on experience. And to me, the most important part are the sections towards the end where he talks about the role of individual ranks, of the private, of the corporal, the sergeant, the lieutenant, of the captain. Because there you see, again, the influence of the Enlightenment, and what he thought was too often forgotten in many armies. And among them, for example, for officers, is the notion that officers need first to treat their troops with love, almost as if they're their children, to take care of them, to make sure they're taking care of themselves. themselves rather, and of course be willing also to sacrifice their lives when it's necessary, which is the rub, right?
Yeah.
But that primarily officers needed to not treat their troops as automatons or as inferior beings, which is an interesting moment really in 18th century military history, I think.
Really, we're talking with Paul Lockhart, author of the Baron de Steuben and the Drillmaster of Valley Forge, about the Baron de Steuben and the making of the American Army. And in talking about treating the troops with love, though, he's not calling for breaking down the ranks or the division between officers and men, as he sees that hierarchy, but then sees a reciprocal relationship that you're establishing.
Oh yeah. And this is something, of course, he practiced. I mean, he never sees himself. He never pals around with the men in a way that would make him their equal. Mm-hmm. But he does joke with them, and he inquires. And he keeps track of things about their personality and their lives, and shows a genuine interest in them. It's exactly. It's kind of more of a modern notion of what officership means, especially in a combat army.
Really, and he, like, we can think of others like Nathaniel Greene, who have really important in the role they're in, but they want a field command. And it seems like when he's in Virginia, he's going to be sent to join Greene, but then other things keep interfering.
Oh yeah, Virginia was. I mean, you could tell his feeling about Steuben's feeling about field command is much different after Virginia in 1780. In 1781, and a lot of that involved conditions that were beyond his control. Clearly the focal points of American war efforts in 1780 were in the Carolinas and in the Northeast, right in the Mid-Atlantic, not in Virginia. And where the British are obviously between Phillips and Benedict Arnold, are putting a big press on Virginia. It doesn't have much. Steuben doesn't have much in the way of resources. The local Virginia militia doesn't prove really up to what he was accustomed to with the Continental Army. And then there's a relationship with Thomas Jefferson, which to me is one of the more interesting ones. Because no matter what you think of Jefferson as a political leader, his record as a war governor of Virginia is not great.
No.
And it's mostly just because he's a man who respected freedom so much that he could not imagine exercising any kind of executive authority.
Right. Yeah. That is part of the problem with Jefferson in Virginia and the British invasion. And we don't need to dwell on that at the moment.
No.
Probably a story for another day.
Yes.
A couple of things I'm thinking about. One is another persistent theme in the book is Steuben always has money troubles. And
yes, and that's the. I think this is just a character feature because he certainly. I mean, he gives the impression of being an acquisitive man, and perhaps he was because he definitely thought about money a lot.
Yeah. But
at the same point, by the same token, he's incredibly generous. And he's no problem giving away things that he owns.
Right.
Staff members who were sick, giving away his silver or his watch. He had a watch. In order to pay for medical treatment, for example. But he's one of the things that struck me as being really interesting as I went through not just the gigantic collection of Steuben papers that was collected in the 70s, but Steuben's personal papers in New York Historical Society, which is not an exhaustive group, but it's most of them, is the proportion of the materials that deal with the receipts. I mean, and mostly for clothing, ridiculous amounts of clothing. And some of his correspondence deals with past debts. As one of his aides wrote, that he'll forever be eating the calf in the cow's belly. And it's because of his inability to deal with money in a adult fashion.
Right.
Largely because of that he's so down on his luck. I mean, it doesn't help that Congress made promises to him and didn't follow through. And what little they followed through, much to his credit, has to be credited to Thomas Jefferson.
Interesting.
But Steuben dies essentially a pauper in the New York wilderness.
Yeah. He has given this little parcel of land in upstate New York where he built a cabin, and he imagines building something grander, but never has the wherewithal to do it.
No, and it is poorly situated anyway. He envisioned a much more rapid development of the land around the Mohawk River, and didn't actually live very close to the Mohawk River. So it wasn't really much of an asset.
I'm wondering, Lafayette, he doesn't really get along with. What about some of the other French officers like Rochambeau or Chastelou, or the others?
Well, he gets along fine with them, especially Rochambeau. In fact, Rochambeau praises Steuben so much, it's hard for Steuben not to be flattered by it. But no, and here's the thing, where it came to, because you see this when Steuben writes about European armies, that he respects different European armies for different things. As somebody who served under Frederick the Great, of course, he's very proud of the fact that he served under the great warrior king of the 18th century. But you can see that he regards the French as being perhaps, I'll say intellectually superior. That doesn't really convey what I mean. More engaged at the level of theory, more willing to try new things, a little bit more adventurous intellectually. And in other words, and I think this is the way that a lot of soldiers regarded the French army in the 18th century as being the army that had the richest intellectual tradition. But his relationship with the French is absolutely fine. And it helps too that Steuben was again regarded himself. And I've had a hard time sometimes discussing this with German American societies. He didn't regard himself very often as German. He generally referred to himself as being European.
Right.
And of course, this is at a time where German nationalism isn't really a thing quite. So it's kind of understandable. And so he regards other European officers as fellow Europeans.
Right. Like Kosciuszko or Pulaski.
And he has pleasant relationships with them. Nothing especially close. That's the thing. Of course, Steuben never really has a very close relationship with anybody, except for his aides. I think the closest he comes to that is that he had pretty good terms with Greene and with Henry Knox.
That's interesting.
But I would never say any kind of intimacy there, and as friends. I don't think he trusted anybody enough to actually get to that level of friendship. Another friendship I always thought was interesting was him and Anthony Wayne, but it never really seems to have transcended the professional. The two men admired each other a great deal, but you don't see any palling around or any evidence of that.
That's interesting. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about his then background, because Baron, the fabrications we were talking about earlier, and he is Prussian, but then his actually title comes from another German principality. You're speaking about not really being a German. There's not a United Germany.
No, there's not. But on the other hand, the nobility. European nobility is pretty cosmopolitan.
That's true.
Especially within the Holy Roman Empire, there's a lot of movement within. And you see even at lower levels, you look at a muster roll of a Prussian regiment in the 18th century, you see Germans from all over the empire, as well as non-Germans. But in this case, Steuben, of course, was dismissed from the Prussian army in 1762. So right before the 7 Years' War ends, unable to get military employment after that because Europe is unfortunately at peace, and armies are downsizing. And so he spends the rest of his career until 1777 as a courtier, primarily with Hohenzollern-Hechingen, with the Prince of Hohenzollern-Hechingen, but he still has ties with Baden-Durlach and a couple of other German principalities. Now, where it comes to the title and all that, again, that's just like the noble pedigree has very often been dismissed. Unfortunately, is eminently provable. I mean, 3 or 4 quarters are definitely noble, and one of the other quarters recently ennobled. I mean, the man's noble status is unassailable.
Right.
Well, as to the title Baron, that creates a lot of confusion because generally the American assumption is you have a title like Baron, clearly you rule something. And no, especially the title Baron. And without getting too much into the weeds, if he had claimed the title of Reichsfreiherr, Baron of the Empire, that would have meant that he would have ruled some territory. Instead, he had the title Freiherr, which came with that Hausorden der Treue, that honorific that he had been given in 1767 or 69, I'm losing the late 1760s, which was not, it's not an honorific in a sense like an honorary PhD is an honorary. It's not really a PhD.
Right, yeah.
It is a mark of esteem and something that would only be given to a noble. But it doesn't mean that he owns a lot of land and he rules something, or So he didn't lie. He was using a title that was perfectly legitimate. But he Frenchifies it, so to speak, as a friend of mine put it. Instead of calling himself the Freiherr von Steuben, he calls himself the Baron de Steuben. Because that's the international language. Even Americans would get French title. They wouldn't give German. Yeah, exactly.
And again, the pronunciation of his name. We've gone back and forth between calling him Steuben and Steuben.
Yes, and that's again, Steuben would be the correct Hochdeutsch pronunciation. This minor anecdote. After Drillmaster came out, I had a really angry email. I got a fair amount of fan mail. I got a really angry email from a man who told me that calling him the Baron de Steuben was like calling Lafayette the Marquis von Lafayette. And I said, no, calling him the Baron von Steuben is exactly like calling Lafayette the Marquis von Lafayette, because Baron isn't a German title. It doesn't go with von. It goes with de.
Interesting.
But clearly Steuben not only referred to himself in the French, and again, French was his preferred language, like as Frederick the Great's preferred language was French. That we know from the way that Americans wrote about him, because Americans very often rendered unfamiliar names phonetically.
Right.
You'll see Steuben written in ways where it's clearly meant to be pronounced Steuben. One I mentioned earlier, Stoobin.
Yeah.
Clearly that's Steuben, right?
Yes.
But never in a way that would be pronounced in the German fashion. So in all his letters, in all his thousands of letters, he never once calls himself the Baron von Steuben. That's a 19th century creation. Unfortunately, it's entered permanently into our parlance, and it seems to be, I've been trying since 2008 to get this changed, and it hasn't worked. Clearly this is the way he referred to himself, and Baron von Steuben is incorrect. But interesting point, when he posed for Peel, for a portrait by Peel, you see Peel's portrait listed in the National Park Service inventory as a Baron von Steuben, but you go to Peel's own catalog and he calls him the Baron de Steuben.
Oh, interesting.
We had to correct Peel.
Interesting. I even stumbled over it when I was reading the title. I wanted to say the Baron von Steuben, but now after we've read the book, I know it is de Steuben. So we'll maintain that fight.
Yep.
Now, does he have any reputation in Europe? Does this go back across the Atlantic about how he's organized his army, or is there any kind of recognition of him there?
Not as much as he would have liked.
Sure.
Now, understand, Steuben definitely has kind of a fantasy world, and one of his fantasies is that he proves himself in America, and he has enough money to get back to Europe, and he'll be a general in the French army or the Prussian army or the Spanish army, who the hell cares, right? I mean, he gets an army and maybe he gets a generalship. And of course, that doesn't happen. I mean, he had French friends who promised him favor after the war. But let's face it, he's by the standards of the day, he's not exactly in his dotage, but he's not young. So no, he never really gets that reputation. Now, later on, but in the 19th century, that as the world develops more of an understanding of what America is.
Right.
I think that changes somewhat, but not in his lifetime. And he was painfully aware of this. And one of my favorite, and I think I quoted it in the book, is him reflecting on the fact that Lafayette, of course, returned to France as a hero.
Yeah.
And was he was disgusted by the fact that he thought women at the French court were fawning all over Lafayette.
Right.
And to him, Lafayette was bereft of ability. He's just somebody who was somebody who kissed up to Washington, right, and was handsome and young, and and so he makes that really genuinely awful remark, but it's also funny, the one where he says that when he points out that women are fawning all over Steuben, he goes, well, you know how it is, women always need their little miracle producing Jesus.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. We're talking with Paul Douglas Lockhart, author of The Drillmaster of Valley Forge, the Baron de Steuben, and the Making of the American Army. Really a fascinating book, and a really great look at not only this character, but the formation of the Army. What surprised you the most in doing the research and writing for this book?
Let's see. One thing is how easy it was. This is the first. I mean, I've written biography before, although disguised somewhat. I wrote a book about Frederick II of Denmark, and it was easy to get to like my character. Steuben, it was really easy to just plain angry at him. You idiot! I mean, what are you doing? Because he's clearly a good-hearted man,
right? Yeah,
and he's clearly got some baggage that he's not letting anybody in on. I mean, there's definitely some hurt inside, But he does so many, he says so many just plain stupid things that sabotage him. The other thing is, of course, that maybe the second thing would be how much he saw himself as a failure. In a way that is not terribly surprising. There's a lot of successful people we remember as being very influential who do not see themselves as being successful. And to him, if he dies poor in a cabin in practically deserted upstate New York, then I can see why by his own lights he would see himself as a failure. Mm-hmm. The third thing is a little more specific, which was something I kind of sensed, but the thing that he's famous for, which is drilling the troops at Valley Forge, to Steuben was something he had to do. To him, his real work, even if it wasn't what he really wanted to do, his real work was introducing basically a system, an infrastructure within the Continental Army that didn't exist there before, whether it came to how you conduct a court martial or the kind of tactical scenarios I brought up from the Blue Book, or the notion of the soldier's book, where soldiers are accountable for everything that's issued to them. Right. I mean, these are all fundamental. These are the kind of things that distinguish the Continental Army from the British Army. The British Army had a system. The British Army had an infrastructure. And without those things, just the simple act of surviving a winter encampment is almost impossible. Right. And to me, that's Steuben saw that as being perhaps the most fundamental contribution, and I can see why. Looking at it, it's not as sexy as making the army tactically the equal of the British, but it's a fundamental importance. Interesting.
And you also make the point, you and he share an affinity for upstate New York, for the Hudson River Valley.
Yes. Oh yes, I mean, several times that. He remarks on the beauty of the Hudson Islands, and if you've ever seen the Hudson from the Verplank House Lawn, you can see why. I mean, it's a beautiful region, and it's hard to match that, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Of course, the whole genre of 19th century painting evokes the Hudson River.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We've been talking with Paul Lockhart, author of the Drillmaster of Valley Forge, the Baron de Steuben, and the Making of the American Army. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. We'll have to have you on again to talk about The Whites of Their Eyes, your book about...
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to talk about Bunker Hill. Yes.
Great. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks. And every week we thank folks in different parts of the country and the world who tune in. And if you're in one of these places and want some Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And so this week I want to acknowledge our listeners here in Massachusetts, in Peabody, Quincy, and in the city of Boston, in Seguin, Texas, Carmel, Indiana, Kansas City, Cordova, Tennessee, Barcelona, Edinburgh, Taipei, Amman, Gothenburg. Did I say Gothenburg right?
Well, it's English.
Oh, yeah, okay. And all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to Jonathan, who will now type us out on the road to Boston.